Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll explain you how to promote the application from the development environment to the production environment. That means we will learn the entire workflow that is involved in moving the application from development to staging, QA, pre-production, production, whatnot. Different environments that are involved regularly in organizations. Before going to that, let me tell you that on this channel, we have done a lot of CI/CD videos. In fact, there is also a dedicated CI/CD playlist. You can check using the link in the description where we have learned how to create CI/CD pipelines. But all that is for one environment. That means we have learned how to create CI/CD pipeline using Jenkins, GitHub Actions, GitLab, AWS Code Pipeline, all the other things. But all this workflow is just for one particular environment. So let's say there is a user, right? And this user wants to make some code changes to the feature branch in his version control system. Let's assume the version control system is GitHub, right? So what I have explained you in all the past videos is how this code commit that user has made to the feature branch of his code repository that is in GitHub using Jenkins by following the continuous integration and continuous delivery approach is deployed onto the target platform that is the Kubernetes cluster in the development environment, or you can consider in one of the environments, right? So just to explain you one more time. So whenever a user makes the code change to the feature branch or to any of the branches that he is assigned with onto the GitHub repository. So what happens is on this GitHub repository, there will be a webhook, and that webhook would trigger the Jenkins pipeline. So the first thing in the Jenkins pipeline would be the continuous integration, where there would be different stages such as code checkout stage, where let's say you're using Java application. So you will check out the Java code, and the next stage would be building and unit testing, where you might use one of the popular build languages for Java applications, that is Maven, to build the application. And to run the unit test, depending upon the unit test framework that you're using, you can trigger the Maven targets. And once this is successful, you will move to the next stage, that is the code scanning stage. And as part of code scanning, what you will do is probably you can verify if your code has any static code or any duplicate code, linting issues, syntax related issues, semantic issues. And one of the popular tools to use this is the Sonar Cube, where it can perform thorough static code analysis and give you reports back. After all of these things is successful, you will move towards the image build creation. That is basically container images, because these days everything is a microservice and all the applications are containerized. And here you can use any of these container platforms such as Docker, or you can use Builda, or you can use Podman. But the popular choice is Docker. And what you will do here, you will create a container image using Docker. Once the container image is created in the same Jenkins pipeline, you will scan the container image that is created. So for code scanning, I mean the image scanning, sorry, you have different types of tools, such as you have Trivi, you have Snyk, or you have Clear. All of these are open source things. You can just configure that as part of your pipeline, and you can scan the image to verify if there is any critical vulnerabilities on the image that you have created. Now let's say if this is also working fine, you will move to the final stage in the continuous integration, that is pushing the image to your image registry. So here, typically it can be Docker Hub or Quay or Artifactory, Nexus, any of the image registries that you are maintaining. So all of these stages are in your continuous integration. Now, once this is done, and once you have the new image, let's say you have a new image called test colon v2, that's the new version of your image. Now the next step would be to update your Kubernetes manifest. For example, you update your Kubernetes deployment.yaml or stateful set or daemon set, whatever your application is, with the new version. And the very good practice, I mean, the good practice is to keep your manifest in a different Git repository. So the one that you see here is your source code repository, and the one that you see here is your image repository, or you can consider it as not image repository, it's basically your manifest repository, because your target platform is Kubernetes or Kubernetes like environments such as EKS, AKS, or OpenShift, Tanzu, anything. So you will update the new version in your deployment.yaml. I'm just taking an example. The name can be anything. You will update in your kind deployment resource in Kubernetes, and from there, if you want, you can put it also as a Helm chart, right? So if you don't want to use plain Kubernetes YAML manifest, you can also use Helm chart, and you can update the new version in the values.yaml of your Helm chart. And then you can use advanced deployment tools or delivery tools such as Argo CD or Flux or Spinnaker. Basically, use the GitOps approach to deploy it onto your Kubernetes platform. This is what we have learned in the past, and this is absolutely fine. But only thing here is this entire thing that you have done is for one particular branch or one particular environment, right? So I've just talked about user committing the code changes onto the feature branch of the Git repository, and this changes getting deployed on your Kubernetes cluster, that is your developer environment or your feature branch environment, whatever you would like to call it. I'm not much worried about the naming convention, but after the feature branch, this changes would move to the main branch, and from the main branch, this would move to the release branch, and from the release branch, this would move to production. So how does the application or how does the code change from the feature branch, from the Kubernetes cluster in the feature branch environment, move to staging environment? From there, it has to move to the UAT or pre-production environment. From there, it has to move to the production environment. So how does this thing happen? Because here we are only talking about one CI/CD pipeline or one Jenkins pipeline that is responsible using Argo CD to deploy it on one Kubernetes cluster, right? So now let's talk about the entire workflow of promoting these changes from this Kubernetes cluster or from the developer environment to the production environment. What all are the steps that are involved? And we will also focus more on the branching strategy and the release process, right? That is how you will learn more about different kind of environments and different levels that are involved in promoting your application to the production, right? We'll focus on the branching strategy, and we'll also focus on the different environments and how the code is promoted. So let me switch to my drawing board and explain you in detail about the things that we want to discuss. So the key factor here is to understand the branching strategy. If you understand the branching strategy, you can assume that you have already understood half of this process, right? So let's start with the branching strategy. Basically, when you have the Git repository, right? So in the Git repository, you create different kind of branches, right? So in an ideal world, there will be feature branches. Feature branches, I'm not talking about a single feature branch, because in ideal world, there will be a lot of feature branches, right? Why there will be a lot of feature branches? Because if you take about a company like amazon.com, right, there can be one development team that is working on one particular part of the application. Like they can be working on a new enhancement called enhancement 1. Okay, so it can be as simple as adding a new UI page. Okay, so one team can be working on adding a new UI page. One team might be working on adding new tables to the database and enhancing the user experience by retrieving additional kind of data to show up to the users. And other team might be working on a different enhancement. Let's call it as enhancement 2. So for all of these things, you need to create feature branches, because the main branch are the master branch. These days it is called as main branch. Previously we used to call that as master branch. And this main branch or master branch would be only one single branch where the active development would be going on. Now, what does that mean? Let's say that there are some fixes, or there are some on the existing code that is already there, the features that went live to the customers, where you want to make some little new features. These are not extensive features, but adding just a very little changes or fixing some bugs to the existing code. All of these things will be considered as active development, which is always going on the main branch. Okay, in some organization, at some point of time, there will not be any new features, then you don't create feature branches, right? So that's what I'm telling you. Feature branches can be 0, 1 or many, but main branch or the master branch is always one where the active development is going on. And then you have release branches. Now, what is release branches? So on the production, let's say you can take example of even your mobile application, where let's say you're using iPhone. So there are different versions that are currently available, right? For the iOS versions that you're using, there can be iOS 10, iOS 11, 12, 13, 14. Now, what are all these things? These are the different versions of your iOS that are available in production. That means you can install iOS 15, iOS 16. There will be 3 to 4 supported versions at any given point of time, and you can install one of these versions, right? So these versions are released to production from the release branches. I'll talk little more about it, but for now, on any or in any organization, these are the 3 branches that are available: feature branch, main branch, and release branches. Apart from that, there will be one more branch which is called as hotfix branches. So these are for the customer issues. Like let's say on the iOS 15, let's say currently the latest version of iOS is iOS 15. And on iOS 15, which is released to the users or the customers, someone has identified a critical bug. Then what you will do is from the iOS 15 release branch, you will create a hotfix branch and you will fix the code on the hotfix branch. And then from the hotfix branch, you will merge the changes to main branch, feature branch, and the release branches. Okay, so hotfix, the name itself indicates that it is something critical that has happened on production. So you are creating a hotfix branch and you are fixing the changes in it and promoting the changes to all the branches. Now, this is the ideal branching strategy. In some organizations, they might have something called as develop branch, integration branch, but it is not the most common practice. Using these 4 branches, you can create CICD or you can manage any sort of applications. And if you take any open source projects or any popular top MNCs or a standardized process in the MNCs, they are using this particular process: feature branch, main branch, release branch, and hotfix branch. I hope this concept is clear. I have also made a detailed video on the branching strategy. I think day 10 of the free DevOps Zero to Hero course. You can also watch that video if you want to understand more details. But if you understand this, we can proceed with the next part of the video, that is how to promote application from developer environment to the production environment, right? Now let's try to understand this part in the detailed way. Okay. So the previous example that I've shown you, the slides I've shown you a pictorial representation, right? In the pictorial representation, I've explained this entire workflow. Now, this entire workflow you can consider as the workflow for the feature branch. Okay, all that I've explained, if you assume that was for the feature branch, that means you have this Git repository. Okay, in this Git repository, let's call this Git repository as payments app Git repository. Okay, so this is a payment app Git repository, and in this there was a user, and this user was working on one of the features, and this user has committed a change to the feature branch in this Git repository. Okay, and you have triggered that Jenkins pipeline. And what did that Jenkins pipeline do? Jenkins pipeline, using Argo CD, it runs all the stages and finally deploys on one of the Kubernetes clusters that is assigned for this feature branch. Okay, but this change has just gone to the feature branch. From feature branch, the change has to go to the master branch or the main branch. Now, what happens once the change goes to the main branch? Then there will be another webhook, okay, that is configured for the main branch, and it would trigger a different Jenkins pipeline. Okay, and this Jenkins pipeline would almost run the same number of stages. Like this Jenkins pipeline would be quite similar to the Jenkins pipeline that you have seen on the feature branch, but the only difference is that now your feature branch changes are merged into the master branch, and in the master branch you have the active development code. So using Jenkins, you would run all the stages that are configured, and you integrate that with Argo CD and deploy it on your staging environment. Now, what is this environment called? This environment is called a staging environment. And for the staging environment, you have a different Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so you have here a different K8s cluster. Some companies might use same Kubernetes cluster here and here. In such cases, they will use different namespaces. Okay, but this is not a good practice. The ideal practice, let's say you are explaining for your interviewer during your interview, if you are explaining this entire process to your interviewer, then explain that from the feature branch, when the changes are committed to the feature branch by the developer, then there is a Jenkins pipeline that triggers and deploys onto the developer Kubernetes platform. Why we call this as developer Kubernetes platform or development environment? Because this is very particular to a specific feature that a development team or one of your developers is working on. Whereas this environment is called a staging environment because your feature branch or your developer who is working on a particular feature has merged the changes into the master branch or the main branch where active development code is available. That means this code is a reliable code. Now this feature branch changes, right? This is only particular to a specific change, but once it is merged to master, it will be integrated with all the other changes that the entire company is working on or the entire project is working on. So it is very, very important to make sure that your feature branch not only works for your changes on the Kubernetes cluster in the developer environment, but it is well integrated with the other changes that went into the main branch or master branch. And the CI/CD pipeline deploys this entire thing by running all the different stages, and finally it gets deployed onto the staging Kubernetes environment. In this staging Kubernetes environment, your QA team or your automated Jenkins tests, or sorry, automated tests, or your QA team, what they can do is once the application is deployed onto the staging environment, they can run additional manual tests. Okay, so your Jenkins pipeline, of course, will have a lot of functional tests or the regression tests or automated tests. Along with that, QA team can run multiple tests, such as they can run some performance tests, right? They can run some DDoS attack tests, or they can verify if there is any. They can do some testing called as pen testing, which is penetration testing. So basically, along with the automation tests that are integrated to your Jenkins pipeline, here QA team, because they own the staging environment, kind of, this is also called as QA environment in some of the companies, they can verify your application for 2 to 3 days or 4 to 5 days. Like, they can take good amount of time and they will confirm that, okay, your application is working fine on the QA environment. Now, similar to this feature, there can be multiple other features where all of them would merge the changes onto the master branch, and your QA environment will keep, your QA team will keep testing the changes on the QA environment. Finally, what will happen is once you are ready for the release, whenever your development team along with your product owner and everyone decides that, okay, we are ready for the release, sometimes this release date is already taken into consideration. So some teams, depending upon their work culture, they will say that every 2 to 3 weeks we will go for a release, or some team would say that whenever we are ready for a release we will go for the release. Now let's not get into that complexities. Let's try to say that whenever the QA team provides a sign off that all the features that you want to take to a release are working fine on the staging environment, then DevOps engineer will create a release branch from the main branch, and from this release branch, Again, you will trigger a Jenkins pipeline. This Jenkins pipeline is called as a release pipeline. What is this called? This is the release pipeline, and this is the most important pipeline. In most of your cases, the pipelines will be similar. The pipeline in the developer environment, the pipeline in the staging environment, and the pipeline in the pre-production from the release pipeline, right? From the release pipeline, you would trigger, from the release branch, you would trigger the Jenkins pipeline. You would run all of these stages. If you want, you can also run some additional stages here. And using Argo CD, you will deploy this onto a pre-production environment. Now, this pre-production environment has multiple names. Some people call it as pre-prod, some people call it as UAT environment, whatever the name can be. In your interview, you can say that from the release branch, we will use Argo CD, deploy it on pre-production environment. We will verify that everything is working on this pre-production environment for some time. And then if everything is looking good, we will promote from the same release pipeline, we will promote to the production environment. And in all of these stages, it is important, or it is a good practice to have different Kubernetes clusters. That means for a development environment, it is good to have a different Kubernetes cluster. For a staging environment, it is good to have a different Kubernetes cluster. For pre-production, for production, you will have different K8s, which is a good practice. In some cases, you can club these two things together and you can have different namespaces. But at least for pre-production and production, you need to maintain different Kubernetes clusters, because nobody will have access to the production cluster. Whereas QE team or development teams, they can have access to this Kubernetes clusters, and pre-production is basically used for debugging any issues on the production environment. Let's say someone says something is not working on the production environment, you will immediately not log into the production environment and debug issues there, but instead you can try to reproduce that kind of issue on a pre-production environment and try to see. There can be multiple customers reporting different sort of issues. So it is ideal to reproduce those issues on pre-production environment and work on that. So finally, what I want to tell you here is it all depends on the branching strategy. Okay. So in most of the cases, the pipeline that you are building, right, will be similar. I'm saying similar because sometimes for a production environment, you can add little more stages. I'll give you an example. Let's say for development environment, you can use all the stages that I've explained in the initial slide, where you will use Jenkins as an orchestrator. And let's say you will run stages such as code checkout. Okay. And you will run stage such as building, unit testing. Okay. And you will run a stage such as code quality analysis. Okay. And then you will run Docker image creation, Docker image scanning, Docker image push, and then you will deploy using the deployment stage or using the Argo CD. Whereas for production environment or pre-production environment, what you can do is additionally, you can add automated tests. Here also you can add automated tests, but for the pre-production environment or production environment, probably automated tests plus you can add pen testing. If you are from QE background, you will understand that there can be different levels of testing. There can be performance testing, and for pre-production environment and production environment, before promoting your application, you can run these tests because these take a lot of time. For development environment and staging environment, you can ignore these tests on each and every commit, right? So this is how your entire code promotion workflow would look like, from development stage to staging to pre-production to production. These are the different things. In some companies, you can use something like Jenkins multi-branch pipelines. Instead of writing multiple pipelines, you can just write one single pipeline. Okay, and you can configure it for multiple branches, or you can use one single Argo CD instance for, like, instead of deploying Argo CD instance for each and every stage, what you can do is your CI can be one particular thing. Your CI can be one Jenkins pipeline, sorry, different Jenkins pipelines. Whereas Argo CD instance can be one single Argo CD instance where it will watch for Git repository, and in the Git repository you can create different folders. Like you can say that this is a folder for development environment, this is a folder for staging environment, this is a folder for or this is a Helm chart for development environment, this is a Helm chart for staging, this is a Helm chart for prod, and in Argo CD you can create applications, right? And each application is watching for a folder, and destination would be your different Kubernetes clusters. Now don't confuse this, or you don't have to complicate it. You can also say that for each environment we have different pipelines. That is also totally fine. Or you can tell your interviewer, if you are quite comfortable, we are using the multi-branch strategy for Jenkins, and we are using single Argo CD instance that is watching for different folders in the Git repository, where in the Git repository we have created different folders. For development environment, we have created a Helm chart that is in one folder called dev, and we have a staging folder, we have pre-prod, we have prod. So this would be source for Argo CD, single Argo CD, and destinations would be different Kubernetes clusters. So dev Kubernetes cluster, staging Kubernetes cluster, pre-prod and prod. It does not matter. End of the day, what matters is how you explain the branching strategy, and you understand how applications are promoted using one Jenkins pipeline or different Jenkins pipelines. But ideally, it's different Jenkins pipelines. In some cases, you can use multi-branch strategy. That's it. Okay. So I hope you have understood this video. If you have any questions, do let me know in the comment section. Or if you have any feedback, you can also let me know that in the comment section. So thank you so much for watching video. If you have anyone who is interested in learning this concept, please share this video with them. Thank you so much. See you all in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.